lately on PFAS issues as this issue is making its way through the system. So without further ado, I don't know which one is going to go first. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm excited to be here today. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Today, we're going to be talking about how to develop a strong legal and technical strategy for PFAS in advance of regulations. I'm going, oh, look at that. It's not showing up on the screen.
Did she not put it up in the?
This is my computer.
That was the one. That won't help. Yeah. We just want to put it in slideshow. These guys that don't have a mouse. Always a challenge for it.
Ah, excellent.
I still know how to do something.
Today, we're going to talk about why we would want to develop a legal and technical strategy and how to do it. So step one, build your team. Step two, know your site. We'll talk about that quite a bit. Track the regulatory developments and develop some goals that are meaningful for you.
I'm going to be rotating back and forth to keep things interesting. So my name is Leah, and I'm going to be joining Kevin today. We're going to be talking about why you should care, right? So why should you develop a PFAS strategy? As Stephen really laid the groundwork really well for this presentation. This is a map of all of the different states that have PFAS sites in them. So there's a patchwork of regulations. Again, one of Steve's slides spoke to that. It's only continued. So Steve's slide talked about regulations out of 2020. That's changed through 2022. States are really leading the way in state regulatory approaches, in part because of the real or perceived gap in federal regulation over these topics. So it's a changing regulatory environment. Widespread, right? So these are all the sites. The military sites are the purple dots and really have been kind of at the forefront. So U.S. military installation is where there's, one in every state, and really is where some of the most data has been gathered from to date. Regulators are active. They're using the existing regulatory framework and permit documents to get information, solicit sampling in some cases, and start to figure out how to impose regulatory standards. So the comment that Steve had in the last presentation about NPDES permits are going to be where the action is, he's right, and it's where it is right now. So states are using their authorities or some of their other permitting authorities we'll talk about in a minute to impose regulations. So step one is to build your team, and who's on that team. Really, we think of it in three different ways. Legal guidance. I'm not just saying that because I'm a lawyer, but I am. But the reason why we're starting here is because this is a very active litigation field. There's been a number of conversations about ongoing cases. The list is too numerous. That'd be an entirely different 45-minute presentation about the ongoing litigation cases. And so proceed with caution in this case, or about this issue. So having a lawyer in-house or external, depending on how your company is organized, to be involved in the communications is critical. This is not something that should just be the EHS team, working on their own, thinking about what their risks are, is my recommendation. Think about how to protect those communications that are about legal risk, strategy, decision making, right? A lot of privileged communications should be involved in that, so that thinking, those notes, the work product that comes from that effort are able, you're at least able to assert a privilege over. And also, lawyers can provide guidance as to what might be discoverable in a litigation, what may not be, what you might be able to protect with privilege. Also, again, I have to say it as a lawyer, think about what you're going to be documenting before you write it down. Before you create a record that has to be discovered, think about what that would look like. That's why we think it's an important member of this kind of, three-party team. Technical expertise, and this conference is focused on that, right? So you're in the right room for technical expertise. This really matters in PFAS conversations. Not every consultant is created equal. And I've been involved in a number of projects where the company's long-term consultant is like, oh, I can do PFAS, but yeah, they really don't have the technical expertise. guidance and experience, and everything from sampling to really understanding that data and then giving strategic technical advice. So get the right people at the table early before you start pulling samples or analyzing your risks. This isn't BTEX compounds. This is more complicated, nuanced technical discussions. And then in-house knowledge. It is critical to have the right people at the table that know the company's current operations and historic operations. And sometimes as people retire and leave, or the next generation comes in, out the door walks your historical knowledge about we did have a fire in this area of the facility, or we used to have this sort of fire suppression system, right? That is really critical information that helps your internal team assess where your risks might be. And that's who you want to have at the table early on in these conversations.
So the next step is to really know your site. And what we're talking about here is understanding how PFAS might migrate through the environment in and around your site. On the screen here, we have a variety of different potential sources and migrations. Groundwater, once it gets into the groundwater, can migrate quite a ways. There's groundwater surface water interactions, the stack emissions that Steve had mentioned, and we'll be talking about later as well. That can drop as particulates or as rain. And so understanding your site in terms of the migration pathways that are possible on your site is pretty important, because PFAS migrates really easily and it doesn't degrade. The pathways are numerous, and it's really important to think through each of these potential pathways. You can have air emissions coming to the soil, you can have soil leaching into the groundwater, soil running off to the surface water, air emissions to a surface water body, your effluent if you have any post-treatment water going to surface water, and runoff going to surface water. We've had clients with each of these become problematic pathways, and so it's important to understand how these things migrate on your facility and where you might have PFAS legacy. So it's important to know your site history. Oh, slide.
Okay, so why are we starting with the history, right? Well, a few of the things that I think of from a legal and risk perspective. What's your insurance status? Do you have insurance that might cover what you discover, or do you not? What sort of long tail policy do you have? And I'll just say that insurance coverage varies drastically. Some policies are written where if you look at them today, it would arguably include PFAS related contaminants, but many companies are rewriting their policies to take that out or to make it be a special rider or special exception. So before you know your landscape on your policy aspect. Also, when it relates to the next bullet, ownership changes, it might have inherited an insurance policy if you were in an acquisition or divestiture status, where you inherited an insurance policy that relates to decades ago. Those are oftentimes the best policies because you might not have some of that exception language that's in today's policy. So obviously these things matter. The site's ownership change over time. As a lawyer, I work on M&A transactions in this space a lot. And, how many times have you had to work on a schedule where you had to disclose certain liabilities or, work through the definitions of what environmental law is or hazardous substances? This is where this matters, right? So I've been involved in looking at, series of transactional documents to trace what sort of disclosures were done at that time, what was the knowledge at that time regarding PFAS contamination, that sort of thing. This is where environmental law meets the application of how you can use those tools to your benefit or understand your risks. Are you going to have coverage or not? And then just a few other kind of things that I think about are your customers asking for information, or are the people that you work with in your, in your supply chain, are they giving you information that is useful to you? Are you giving information to others? How informed is the information that you're giving to your customers, if that's the lay of the land? And, how can you be sure about what sort of information you have to give for your permit, for example? So thinking about the history to understand kind of the lay of the land today is really important to kind of kick things off.
The first example we're going to talk about is HSE as it relates most directly to the petrochemical industries. And I think when we're talking about knowing your site history and knowing where your fire training areas were, because those are likely sinks in your environment, places where you've got a big footprint of AFFF. But also, as Leah had noted, the technical folks that you've got in your team and the in-house knowledge can give you information about where you've had issues in the past. Those historical fires are important as well. Knowing where that AFFF was deposited is key to understanding an efficient approach for identifying what levels you may have and where else it might have gone, not just in terms of spray, but in terms of groundwater migration, surface water migration, things of that nature. AFFF is a big deal in the petrochemical industry, as you all know, and the formulations have changed, but there are quite a few examples of AFFF sites that have significant footprints and significant liabilities associated with them. All right, knowing your site history, where have you sent your wastes? Understanding where your historical disposal practices have placed materials, both in solids and in liquids, is important for you to understand how to have an efficient approach of characterizing your site and understanding your liability, and eventually moving to remediation as well. There's been an evolution of practices as we talked about the phase outs of the A-chain C8 carbon PFOS and PFOAs. One of my first jobs as an intern at Barr was managing manifests for a cleanup at a site where a former miner had spent solvent drums. And at the time, the best guidance was to take those drums and bury them under 3 feet of soil and let them be. Obviously, that created a significant environmental liability for them that got pretty expensive to clean up later. So the evolution of practices is important as you consider what you need to do moving forward, and understanding that what you did in the past, even though it was appropriate at the time, may have a pretty long tail to it. So understanding your current operations is important as well, both in terms of your processes and your use of AFFF or other PFAS compounds. I know we're talking a lot about refineries and terminals today, but we do work for other clients who use PFAS in treatment of textiles or papers. There's a reason your fast food wrapper doesn't allow that grease and oil to get into the bag. It's because they have PFAS coatings on them. Those in the life cycle of those things can be pretty significant as they go to end disposal facilities like landfills. Their PFAS is also in consumer products. So as we talk about the processes of a particular industry, understanding what material inputs you're bringing in, what sort of operational considerations, and the products that you're sending out, as well as the byproducts. So a lot of places are taking a look at what they've got for PFAS coming into their facility, trying to do a mass balance. What is coming in either surface water brought into the facility for their process itself. We do a lot of work with taking a look at SDSs for facilities, trying to understand what they're bringing in. And a lot of those can be, let's say, challenging to really figure out what's inside of it, because they say it's trademarked or confidential information. Policies, as Leah noted, the permits that you have currently are likely going to be the way that the regulators come to you and approach your site and say, hey, you've got this permit, we're going to add PFAS to your permit and force you to sample that. And then when I talk about policies, I'm talking about like, what are the internal processes that you have for understanding what you're bringing onto your site? Are you checking to see if materials that you're bringing onto your site have PFAS, and how thorough are you in it? Excellent. This is the joy of having a two-person presentation team and flipping back and forth, not flipping anybody off.
very.
It's very different. Thank you. So in terms of your current operations, a lot of facilities have water treatment as part of their facility, and that effluent treatment, there was a question earlier about how do you deal with PFAS, and carbon sorption is a lot of what folks do. There's also ions and resins that can absorb PFAS as well. But you know, when we're talking about your effluent treatment, you need to understand, is it even being treated? Because if you don't have something specifically focused on PFAS, it's not being treated. When we're talking about granular activated carbon and things like that, there's a lot of competition in your water chemistry for those sites. And so there's a lot of pre-treatment that gets a lot of attention because you need to make sure that you're taking out the things that are going to take up those carbon sites and make that carbon be used up before the PFAS can absorb to it. So the other piece of it is, as we've talked about, PFOS and PFOA are the two most regulated compounds now. There's a large family of compounds that are coming. Which compounds are you being asked to measure? Which compounds are you being held to in your permits? To what concentrations? You know, we talked about 70 parts per trillion being a drinking water standard. A 4 order of magnitude reduction in that can be really significant in terms of the technical feasibility of treatment. And the other thing I wanted to just note here is that your effluent discharges are going somewhere. I'm from Minnesota, I live in Minneapolis, and we get our drinking water in Minnesota, in Minneapolis in particular, from the Mississippi River. So the effluent discharges are our drinking water source, indirectly, of course. Byproducts of treatment, we'll talk about a little bit, but oftentimes you end up with biosolids as your byproduct, and those are the focus of the next slide. Not my slide.
So just quickly about biosolids, they're, you know, it's more common in certain areas of the country, right? But sometimes POTW or industrial facilities will use their biosolids as a soil additive. And so they're, you know, applied on thousands of acres, and there can be uptake through crops and in farm watering ponds. There's a very high profile, actually a number of high profile cases in New Hampshire where there was some, you know, very contaminated farmland via soil, via paper manufacturing biosolid applications. And the cows, it bioaccumulates in humans and in animals. And it would have stayed in both the milk products and the meat of the cattle that consumed it. It was actually a very prominent case in Texas too, now that I think about it. So that was a farm very close to a military installation. So it immediately raises questions about food supply, food safety, and consumer safety, right? This is one of the areas where these issues dovetail very directly to consumers thinking about their health. And that always increases, heightens the sense of risk. And you know, what that means is that FDA has been sampling for PFAS in food for decades and releases studies. They've been doing more frequent releases really to address this issue. But just thinking about it from a practical standpoint, the biosolids applications are usually done via agreements. Those are, you know, legal binding agreements to be considering. And it depends on where you're applying. What's the geography? Are you applying near a surface water or an area that might lead to uptake? Are the lands used for crops, and are you applying to the same fields for decades? That's really been some of the hallmark risks that the New Hampshire case involved. Kevin, for the next two.
The other part about knowing your facility in terms of where you're sitting relative to other folks, your facilities in your neighborhood can provide PFAS that comes onto your facility, and it's a little bit tricky to sort out whose PFAS is it. We do have some techniques, you know, they call them fingerprinting. You're looking at the distribution of the different compounds and seeing what might be representative of this manufacturing facility versus an AFFF, for example. When you have multiple manufacturing facilities, it gets a little bit trickier. And when you have mixes, it becomes very difficult. But aerial deposition can be a source from a neighboring facility that contributes to your PFAS footprint. You can have groundwater upgradient sources coming onto your facility. And if you've got any wells on your site, whether you have processed water or drinking water supplied to your staff through wells, that can be a direct exposure pathway as well. Surface water transport can be a big deal as well. The wind is variable, as we all know. you can have transport for dozens of miles. So when I'm talking about knowing your neighborhood, it's not just who's next door, it's who's in a 30-mile radius of you, and what might that contribution of PFAS be. The other piece is neighbors could be sources, neighbors could be receptors, right? So if you've got PFAS and it's going off site, that can create a pretty significant exposure risk for you and your entity. This graphic just shows that, you know, where you've got water drawing and water discharging, that might be an upstream source for you. That might be a downstream receptor that's getting water that you're contributing to pollution. So it is really location dependent. That may include active PFAS use at those facilities. It may include PFAS that comes onto that facility and just passes through because it hasn't been treated with intention. Taking a look at that source differentiation, you know, we touched on briefly the fingerprinting. You can look at the concentrations, you can look at those distributions of the different compounds and get an understanding of where this PFAS is coming from.
I'm going to talk about the private well slide in part because, again, this is getting close to liability risks, right? When people are drinking water, they are more likely to be very concerned about this issue, and it's something they can see and they can sample. You know, so wells are receptors both from a private well standpoint as well as municipal wells. And, you know, Stephen's slide talked about the sampling effort that's really been that's started at EPA. It's going to continue and increase in frequency and reaching smaller and smaller municipal water systems that are going to be required to sample. The other thing is in certain areas of the country, really all areas, I would say, there's very active citizen groups, citizen sampling brigades, right, that are you know, learning about PFAS, getting scared about PFAS, and then taking their own samples and wanting to know what it means, and don't have the sophisticated experience. And again, this is a very technical area to understand that, you know, their water system might be completely fine at 2 or whatever, right? Again, no federal standard. So immediately there's this race to zero. And so there's a number of very public class actions that relate to people whose wells have been impacted by PFAS in dozens of states. There's a very high profile one in Wisconsin that already is subject to a class action settlement, and another group that's going through the litigation process, and will ultimately lead to extension of public water, I think. That's going to be kind of a continued, you know, solution in some of these cases, but it's a very significant concern. So knowing where the wells are, your receptors, is really key to thinking about the risks that might be going forward. And maybe it talks, you know, it maybe helps advise you about how aggressive to be in your kind of, you know, assessment and risk calculations. And of course, surface water as a drinking water source, you know, it's not, that's where a lot of those rules are going to be applied at a state level. It's going to be in discharge limits to surface waters. And, you know, part of that is because of the calculations that Stephen showed regarding, you know, fish, but also drinking water sources. And states are often making lower requirements based on if it's a drinking water source or not. And so knowing, again, what that regulatory framework might be is really key.
So the point here is that there are a lot of different factors that can make this a pretty complex topic. Technically complex, it's legally complex. Operationally, I mean, when we're talking about the petrochemical industry, AFFF primarily is an operational risk. And for other facilities that use PFAS in their actual manufacturing process, finding a reasonable substitute that provides that effect that you need can be pretty challenging as well. Leah touched on this. The public perception piece of this seems to be the biggest driver, and it's the biggest driver that I've seen in my 23 years. It's public fear driving PFAS regulations, and it's become a nonpartisan issue. Everybody on both sides of the aisle is getting behind driving these regs, and I mean from a political standpoint, not necessarily from a technical standpoint. Supply chain, you know, understanding what you're bringing onto your facility, understand what's going off your facility. The financial implications, I think, are important as well, because as we're talking about this before the regulations come into place, you can take some actions now. You can budget for sampling, you can budget for material swap outs, you can understand what's going on before you're really under the gun and use the time to your advantage. The compliance aspect is going to be coming, and getting ahead of that, I think, is going to be pretty critical for folks. The way that it seems to be going, at least in the areas that I'm working in, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, it's a source reduction goal. So they look at what's in the water. Okay, well, it didn't get treated at the wastewater facility. Where did it come from to get to the wastewater facility? And then they're chasing those folks down. So it really is coming back to the folks who are using it, and rather than saying, okay, well, we know it's getting to the wastewater facility, let's treat it there. That's really expensive. So they're going upstream to look at source reduction. The next step is developing a tracking system. Now you can partner with legal entities. You can have your own internal tracking system. This slide in particular shows the log scale on the left and time on the bottom, and really just shows the evolution of concentrations. These are advisory levels in states. So we've got Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin, New Hampshire and New York, things that we've got a downward trending criteria, and it seems like that's only going to continue. The other piece to consider here is that your PFOS and PFOA, which have been leading the way in terms of development of criteria, are really just the vanguard, because we are going to have other compounds that are going to be regulated as well.
Okay, so we started with why should you care? Hopefully we've convinced you that you should care a little bit or a lot, depending on your circumstances. But again, dynamic regulatory environment. I cannot stress enough about how significant it is to know where your facilities are, take an inventory of where the states are in that process, and then look at what existing permits you have or authorizations, right, to the POTW or to the state. In a SPDS context, and what authorities does the agency have to require sampling? What is their regulatory timeline for that? Can they use their existing authority under the permit or under the statute to require you to sample? And I'll tell you, the state's authority are being litigated in a number of states because states want to get data. They don't yet have, sometimes rulemaking, just like the federal process, is complicated in a state process. And so they want to use their existing authority to get some data to figure out what to do. I understand that I understand why they might want the data, but they should be able to legally get it. And so knowing what your permits you already agreed to do in that permit is very important. And the state's authorities vary by what they have the authority to do. Is it to inspect? Is it to sample? If you choose to sample because you want to get a better assessment of what your risks are at the facility, and you want to do a limited or a broad sampling effort, you name it, you would decide you want to collect a sample, I would highly recommend you think about what your authority is to the state or federal or perhaps contractually to report that data. It varies by state. It varies significantly by state. You can't keep that attorney-client privileged in many states. And so this is what I tell all of my clients, before you pull a sample, think about how you're going to use that data, because you might have to be either producing it to a state agency or certainly being available for discovery in a litigation context if you're ever in that context. So think before you sample. That's why getting somebody like Kevin and his team involved early will help you think about strategically, do I need to sample? Where can I assess my risks? What other sorts of information can I gather before I do that? So think before you pull samples. This is just, we'll kind of quickly hit this and then make sure we leave some time for questions. So, think about where you want to be. What's the goal? As facilities call us every day and they say, what should I be doing now about PFAS? And I start by saying, well, what's your goal? Do you want to identify and start embarking on a source reduction? Do you want to identify risks? Do you want to mitigate those risks? What sort of public disclosure, public information do you want to be in a position of having? And that really depends by the company, by your corporate risk strategy, by the risk tolerance, all of those considerations. I highly recommend getting the public affairs teams of your companies involved, if you have such a team, to really think through what the goals might be. Again, this should not be, the EHS unit kind of acting on their own. So, just like any other, good goal in our personal or professional lives, goals should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely. That's it. That's how you spell smart. So, think through those things, right? Measurable, right? Do you want to get that data? What are you gonna be doing with that data? Will it be discoverable in a litigation context is what I think of from a legal risk standpoint. Kevin's gonna wrap us up here.
Oh, just to cover what we talked about, the summary is you build your team. You need to have legal folks involved. You need to have some technical know-how, what you're doing, and be able to trust your data. Good data allows you to make good decisions. Bad data does not. And knowing what you know about your facility and getting those folks on your team is really important. There's a lot of knowledge that's in-house that's really important. Understand your site, both in terms of what processes are going on at your facility and your neighbors. Where are you a source? Where are you receiving materials from other places? Or the regulations, be on top of it, track it, get a plan in place for understanding what's coming and when it's coming so you can know what you want to do and set goals so that you're reasonable. And setting your goals is a big deal in terms of being aligned with your corporate values. So having those guys, having that mindset is also important. Thank you very much. I think we're a little bit of time to ask questions, but we're pretty close. Do we have any questions?
We got 10 minutes.
We have 10 minutes.
Hit us.
Exactly right on
All
time.
right, so I got one question.
All right.
State Minnesota just released their PFAS monitoring